Welcome to the Olive Grove Podcast, everybody. Ready for another deep dive?
Always.
Today, we're looking at Daniel chapter 9.
Oh, that's a good one. Lots to unpack there.
It is. We'll be using an article from the My Christian Space website as our guide, and they use the complete Jewish Bible translation, so we'll be sticking with that too.
Sounds good.
Okay, so to set the scene, Daniel's in Babylon. He's been exiled there.
Right.
And he's studying Jeremiah's prophecies.
Mm-hmm.
And he realizes something. The 70 years of captivity that Jeremiah talked about.
They're almost over.
Exactly. That's got to be a pretty intense realization.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, think about it. You've been living in exile, and suddenly the clock's ticking down. What do?
Well, what Daniel does is pray. And not just any prayer. This is like deep, heartfelt, pouring it all out to God kind of prayer.
Yeah, the source really breaks down what makes this prayer so powerful. It's not just a quick help me out kind of thing. It's much more than that.
No kidding. He lays out the whole situation, acknowledges how Israel messed up, how they turned away from God.
Doesn't shy away from the tough stuff. And that's where the humility comes in. The source talks about this too. Sackcloth and ashes. That wasn't just for show back then.
No, it was serious business.
It was a visible sign of repenting, recognizing God's righteousness, and their need for forgiveness.
Almost like saying, God, we messed up. We know you're right to judge us. But then there's also this hope woven throughout the prayer, this trust in God's faithfulness.
She is the covenant, right?
Exactly. That promise, that binding agreement between God and his people.
And that covenant, even when Israel messed up, God's commitment, his promises, they don't just disappear.
Right. So Daniel's owning their sin, but he's also clinging to that hope that's rooted in God's character.
It's a powerful combination. Recognizing our own brokenness, but at the same time, holding on to God's unwavering love. It's like, we don't have to be perfect to earn his love. It's a gift.
And speaking of gifts, the source points out something really interesting about the exile itself. It says that even though God punished Israel, it wasn't even the full extent of what their sin deserved.
Whoa. Grace in action, right there. It's not about getting what we deserve, but about getting God's mercy, his favor, even when we fall short.
And sometimes admitting our need for God, turning back to him, that's what opens the door to that grace.
That's good. I like that.
So we've got Daniel pouring out his heart to God, and then boom.
What happened?
The angel Gabriel shows up while Daniel is still praying.
No way. Talk about an answer to prayer.
Right. And the source even mentions that Gabriel was, quote, highly esteemed by God. Makes you wonder, what does our relationship with God look like? Does it affect how he responds to us?
That's a good question to think about. But anyway, Gabriel comes with a message.
Oh, yeah. A big one. The prophecy of the 70 weeks. This is where things get really fascinating.
Buckle up, though.
Seriously. So the source breaks it down like this. 77s, meaning weeks of years. And they lay out this specific timeline for Israel.
Okay, I'm following so far.
So 69 of these weeks, they cover the rebuilding of Jerusalem and the arrival of the Messiah. And the wild thing is, when you look back at history, it lines up with incredible accuracy.
You're telling me it's almost like too perfect to be coincidence, makes you want to dig into all those historical details, see how it all fits.
Totally.
Yeah.
But then there's that 70th week, the big one. The source calls it the Great Tribulation.
Oh, yeah, that's heavy stuff. Connects to Revelation, too, right? All that end times imagery.
Exactly. And here's the other mind-blowing part. We're currently living in this gap between the 69th and 70th week.
Wait, what? A gap?
Yeah. It's not factored into those 70 weeks because it's called the time of the Gentiles or the time of grace.
Yeah.
So where do we fit in all this? What does it mean for us?
And what does it say about how we understand those end times prophecies? Lots to ponder there.
Definitely.
That gap, that time of the Gentiles, like our source calls it, the time of grace. It makes you wonder, where are we in all of this, in God's plan?
Right. What does this time of grace even mean for us? I mean, we're living in it, right? But thankfully, our source from My Christian Space gives us some clues.
Yeah, it does say this time of grace is like God extending his mercy. It's a time when salvation is open to everyone.
Not just Jewish people, like in the Old Testament.
Exactly. The focus shifts, right? It's not just about that specific covenant with Israel anymore.
It's about the whole world.
Yeah. With Jesus, with the Messiah coming, God's plan expands. It's for everybody now.
So this time of the Gentiles is like the gospel's time to shine, to go global. So people from, everywhere can get to know God. Through Jesus, of course.
That's the idea. Now, our source doesn't go super deep into all the theological stuff about this gap, but it does ask some pretty interesting questions.
Oh, like what? Like how should knowing we're in this time of grace change how we live?
Yeah, that's one. I mean, if this is such a big chance for people to find God, what's our part in all of this? Spreading the good news, all the
And how does knowing all this change how we see what's happening in the world today?
Exactly. It's like, where do we fit in the big picture? This source really wants us to think about these things.
It does. Okay, but let's go back to the prophecy for a sec. There's something else in those 70 weeks that our source points out.
Oh, yeah. What's that?
It's about those first 69 weeks, how they actually happened.
Ah, you mean how specific they are.
Exactly. Like it talks about a decree to rebuild Jerusalem.
Right, which actually lines up with a real historical event.
And then it predicts the Messiah coming, which for Christians, that's Jesus.
And the timing. Spot on.
Crazy, right? So if those first 69 weeks are that accurate, doesn't it make you think the rest of it's got to be pretty reliable too?
It does make you wonder about those events that haven't happened yet, especially the ones tied to that 70th week.
Especially because that 70th week, it doesn't sound like a picnic. Remember, our source called it the Great Tribulation, all that hardship, persecution.
Intense stuff. People have different ideas about what'll actually go down, but our source seems to be saying it's judgment time, purification for the world.
Whoa, something to think about, right? Makes you want to get right with God. But the main point is, it hasn't happened yet.
Not yet, which is why we've got this gap, this grace period, like hitting pause on the timeline so God can show his mercy before all that unfolds.
But it's not going to last forever, right?
Yeah.
Our source is pretty clear about that.
Nope. The 70th week's still coming. And when it does, things are going to change. Big time.
So, knowing that, what should we be doing?
Good question. What do you think our source would say? Urgency, maybe?
Like urgency to tell people about the gospel, urgency to grow in our own faith.
And to get ready for what's coming. We might not know the day or the hour, but that prophecy tells us it's coming. And it'll be a time of reckoning.
Okay, so we've got this gap, this time of grace, and then this huge tribulation coming. But where does Daniel's prayer fit into all of this?
That's a really good question. Remember what Daniel was praying for?
Oh, for Jerusalem to be restored. For God's people to come back from exile.
Yeah. So in a way, his prayer is almost like a sneak peek at that final restoration. The one that's going to happen after those 70 weeks are done.
When everything's set right again.
Yeah.
When God's plan is fully realized.
Yeah.
When sin's dealt with once and for all. Wow.
Right. So Daniel's prayer, it's not just about him or even just about Israel. It's like he's praying for God's whole plan for the world to be fulfilled.
And in a world that feels so messed up sometimes, that's powerful, knowing that God is still in control, that he's got it all figured out.
And knowing that should give us hope, real hope.
Not just a sit back and wait kind of hope, though.
Right. No way. It's a hope that pushes us to do something, to live differently, to show that we believe God's promises, to share that hope with others.
Because we know what's coming, eventually.
That's it. We've covered a lot, haven't we? Those 70 weeks, the gap, the tribulation, and God's plan to make everything new.
And it all starts with Daniel's prayer, his humility, his honesty about his people's mess-ups, his rock-solid faith in God's promises.
And it brings us back to that question, right? What does all this mean for us right now?
I think it's a wake-up call. To look at our own hearts, to share the gospel like it matters. Like we don't have all the time in the world.
We are in this gap, this grace time, but it won't last forever. How are we using it?
That's the question, isn't it? How are we making it count?
It's something to think about.
Okay, so we're back for the final part of our deep dive into Daniel chapter 9. Here on the Olive Proof podcast, of course.
We've been through a lot, haven't we?
We have. Daniel's prayer, those 70 weeks, this whole time of the Gentiles thing.
It's a lot to process.
It is. But before we wrap up, I think it's important to bring it back to, what does this all mean for us, like practically speaking, in our everyday lives?
That's where it gets really interesting, actually, because our source, it focuses mostly on, the history and the prophecy of Daniel chapter 9.
Right.
But it also kind of hints at some things that are really relevant for us today, personally.
Whoa. I'm all ears.
Okay, so remember how we talked about Daniel's prayer being like a model for us?
Yeah, how specific it was, how humble, how it was all rooted in that covenant.
Exactly. And those things, they're not just ancient practices. They're things we can do too, even now.
So you're saying that understanding these 70 weeks, it should change how we pray.
Absolutely. I mean, when we get this big picture view of God's timeline, and where we are in it with this gap and all, shouldn't our prayers reflect that?
So it's not just about bringing our own little problems to God. It's about, lining up our prayers with what he's doing in the world.
That's it. And this ties in with what the source says about the time of grace, too. We hear that phrase all the time, but do we really get it? It's not just a, theological idea. It's a real window of opportunity.
An opportunity for what?
For people to come to know God. That's what our source is saying. This gap, it's a time for the gospel to spread far and wide,
Right.
and we're part of that. What we do, the choices we make, it all matters.
So it's not just about waiting around for the end times. It's about, doing something now, being part of God's plan in this moment.
Yes, exactly. And knowing that the 70th week, with all that tribulation stuff, it's still out there. It should make us even more passionate about sharing the gospel, about caring for others.
There's that urgency again, okay, we've got this time, but it's limited, so how are we going to use it? How are we going to make the most of it?
Those are the questions, right? And there's one more thing I wanted to touch on. It's about trust.
Trust.
Yeah. Think about Daniel. He got this huge prophecy, right? He understood how big God's plan was. But he didn't freak out. He didn't lose hope.
He just kept serving God, knowing that God was ultimately in control.
That's it. And that's
Right.
something we can learn from, too. Especially these days when things feel so uncertain, so scary. Knowing that God has it all figured out, even the parts we don't understand, it's a huge comfort.
It is. And that trust, it should give us the courage to keep going, to face whatever comes our way.
Wow, this has been an incredible deep dive. I feel like we've only just scratched the surface of Daniel chapter 9.
Me too. But I'm walking away with a whole new perspective.
Isn't the Bible, it's not just ancient history, it's alive,
Yeah.
It speaks to us today, it challenges us, encourages us, changes how we see the world.
That's the beauty of it.
And for everyone listening, we really encourage you to check out Daniel chapter 9 for yourselves. The My Christian Space website, which we've been using for this deep dive, is a great resource. They've got tons of info there. And of course, make sure you're subscribed to the Olive Grove podcast on YouTube for more deep dives like this one.
Oh, and don't forget, you can visit the My Christian Space website for early access to the podcast, too.
As you go about your week, think about this. Knowing we're in this gap time, this time of grace, how does that change how you live today? How does it affect how you relate to God?
It's a question worth pondering.
Yeah.
Thanks for joining us on the Olive Grove podcast.